Yeah? Okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear it. Glad to be able to talk with you guys. I have really enjoyed the series that we've been doing on identity. I remember when I was in grad school, I did a developmental psychology class, and it's so interesting that identity is such a fundamental piece of our experience. We talk about infants, and there's that moment when they kind of understand that they are a different entity from their parent. We see 2-year-olds that go through the terrible twos, and that time when they decide that they have a different will, they have a set of preferences and desires and things that are different, and they exert that in their families and in their world. Later on, we see kids have a lot of different experiences with identity, but in adolescence, it's so profound that often they will try on different identities, and all of us have a tendency to do this. Am I this kind of person? What are my values? What am I about? Who do I want to be as I move into adulthood? It's a struggle that we fight with often through young adulthood, and then often later in life we see in middle age, people have this midlife crisis. Who am I? How did I spend my life? Is this what I want to be? Is this what I want to do? And then in older adults, we see often people's roles change. I'm no longer a parent in the way that I was. I'm no longer an employee in the way that I was. Who am I now? And so identity is something that runs through the entire course of our lives, is for many of us a struggle. What does this mean? Who am I? What is my experience here? And if we can find our identity in our faith, if we can find our identity in our relationship with Christ, that whole walk becomes exponentially easier. So tonight we're going to talk about freedom, but I always like to kick things off with a story, so I'm going to tell one on myself. So about 15 years and 10 or 15 pounds ago, I was all about rock climbing. That is what I did. I absolutely loved it. I was in school, I worked and did church and climbed. That was most of my world. A ton of my friends were other people who rock climbed, and I spent a lot of time focused on that. I did a bunch of trips. I went all over the place and rock climbed. It was something that I was really focused on and really energized about. And so I had a group of friends that said, hey, we're all going to go down to this one climbing area. Do you want to come with us? And it was a huge group of people that were meeting out there, probably like 45 people that were headed out there. So I went out, we spent the entire weekend climbing, and we got there on a Friday night, did a couple of routes, and hung out, and I was sitting around the campfire. It was probably 10:30 or 11 at night with a buddy of mine, and a couple of guys came up, and they were like, hey, we are going to go do this route called the Squeeze Chimney. Do you guys want to come? And probably the first warning was the name, but I was like, yeah, sure, we'll go, yeah, okay. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to go get my stuff, and they're like, you won't need any of your stuff. Like, just grab some climbing shoes and come with us. Warning number 2 was probably that. And so I went and got my stuff, and we started hiking up to the side of this mountain. And we hiked for a little ways and kind of wander up halfway through there, and I look up, and there's really no climbing routes. This isn't an area where any climbing really happens. And I'm like, what's going on here? I was a little confused, which is probably warning number 3. If you're keeping tally, we're racking them up here. And so I'm looking around, and finally one of my buddies looks at the ground, and he's like, okay, this is it. This is the spot. And he gets down on his hands and knees and crawls into the rock. And, there's probably about a dozen of us, so people just start kind of getting in line and going through this and climbing back into this mountain. Well, nobody else except for one of my buddies knew that I'm kind of a little bit claustrophobic. Like, I don't really like even sleeping on the bottom bunk. A little bit of anxiety with that. But, I couldn't tell everybody. Like, I couldn't let everybody know that part. So I was like, okay, it doesn't look too bad. I'm just going to, man up and give it a shot. I'm going to give it a try. And so I hop down there and get in line, and I'm kind of crawling back into this mountain. We go for about 20 feet into the mountain. And then my buddy's like, okay, now for this part, you've got to lay down, and it's basically 2 slabs of rock that are on top of one another. And the guy says, you're just going to have to kind of wiggle back through there, but before you start, choose what direction your head's going to face. Because when you get in there, you can't, it's too shallow, it's too low to be able to turn your head over. So choose which direction you're going to go, and then kind of keep pushing back there. So I'm like, okay, it's not that far. It's only, 10 or 12 feet of this. So I think I can do it. So I get in there, And I start kind of wiggling back there, and there's a pretty big group of us, and so the guys in front of me start there's kind of a bottleneck. And while it's not very far back there, I was in this thing for probably a minute and a half, and my good buddy that was so supportive and had my back so much, that was right behind me, he was the one guy that knew I was kind of claustrophobic, started saying stuff like, "Hey, Sean, I think I felt the rock move. Did you feel that?" Which was a super big help, So at this point, man, my heart is racing, like I'm breathing kind of shallow, starting to freak out a little bit. Finally, the line kind of clears, and I'm able to kind of get to the other piece, which ended up being about 30 feet of a chimney that you kind of put one foot on one side, one hand on another, and climb back out. And there was this moment when I got to the top of that I reached up and I pulled and finally saw stars, saw my friends standing there. And if you've ever seen any prison escape movie, there's always this moment where the guy finally sees freedom for the first time in however many years, and there's this this first breath of fresh air. And for me, it was a powerful moment. I was free. I was done with that anxiety. I was done with that abject terror. Like, I tell this story, I have genuinely had nightmares about this moment in the years past. It was a tough moment for me. And so it was a pretty incredible experience to walk out of that. So when I think about freedom, that's the moment that pops into my mind first. Freedom, being free, is absolutely fundamental and core to our identity in this country. We had the 4th of July here earlier this month, and I would guess that if you wandered around this parking lot that was absolutely packed full of people to watch the fireworks across the street, I would guess that if you walked around on the 4th of July and said, "What is today about? What is it about? What are we doing here?" that one of the main answers you would have gotten would likely have been, "We are celebrating our freedom. We are a free people." It's core to who we are. We still like to see ourselves as a group of scrappy rebels throwing off the shackles of a tyrannical king, fighting against injustice and standing up for our own freedom. We see ourselves in that light, and it's an awesome light to see ourselves in. So I want to take a shift here. I want to jump into the verse that was read a little bit earlier. Let's look at John 8, starting in verse 31. To the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples, and then you will know truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves to anyone. How can you say we will be set free?" Jesus replied, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the son sets you free, you are free indeed." Now, I am definitely not an Old Testament scholar, but I'm not sure you have to be to look at their answer and have a little bit of a question mark here. We are Abraham's descendants. We have never been slaves to anyone. What? I mean, maybe they're looking at it from some angle that I don't get. But man, when you look at the Jewish culture, we see Passover being one of the fundamental, most important holidays, one of the most important moments of the year, the time that God freed the Israelites from the Egyptians. Slavery and freedom from slavery is a core part of their identity. Even now, when they're having this conversation, they are an occupied people. They live in a nation that Rome has its thumb on. They are a heartbeat away from slavery as this conversation happens. So when I read this, I'm like, what? You've never been slaves to anyone? How do you get from here to there? But now I know you guys, we've never been slaves to anyone, right? We're Americans. We stand up for ourselves. Freedom, come and take it. Come try to make us slaves. There'll be a gun behind every blade of grass, right? We won't be slaves to anybody. But I want to challenge that idea a little bit, because I think that we are a lot closer to slavery in a lot of ways than we want to admit. There's a couple of ways that we can end up being slaves. There's a couple of things that we can end up being slaves to. First of all, we can end up being slaves to the labels that get thrown around. I know all of us have witnessed this experience when we see a child walk into kindergarten or first grade the very first day, and maybe they're a kid that developmentally is just a little bit behind, or maybe they're just not the kind of kid that's really great at sitting in a classroom all day, and man, that teacher, they've got their work cut out for them. And so day after day, week after week, that kid is that teacher's job, man. Just trying to keep them focused, just trying to keep them on the right stuff, and as the weeks go by, as the teacher's frustration mounts, it's so easy for them to walk in every morning and be like, well, what's Timmy up to? How do I keep him focused? And over the course of the year, that kid earns the label of troublemaker. That kid earns the label of problem. They walk into second grade. First thing the teacher tells them is, hey, watch out for this kid. He's going to be trouble. And it can completely change the course of this child's educational experience and the trajectory of their entire lives. And please don't hear me beating up on teachers. You guys have the hardest job in the world. And to be totally honest, I think this happens a lot less often today than it did decades ago, because I think there's a lot more awareness about that. But it does still happen sometimes, and it's heartbreaking when we see a label identify and hang with somebody forever that they can't break free of. I often wonder if we don't do things because we are so scared of the label that might be added to us, that label changes the choices that we make, the decisions that we make, the behaviors that we engage in. Man, I don't want this label. If I do this thing, I'm going to get this label. If I don't do this thing, then I won't be considered this. And we end up in this space where we can be kind of in bondage, in slavery to what people think, to what the labels are that we have. The second one sounds a little counterintuitive, but I'm going to throw it out there. We can be stuck. We can be enslaved by our achievements. I know a lot of times we think a different direction than that, but I think we all have seen people that, man, they did something awesome and they spent the rest of their life trying to chase that thing. I remember hearing a story about a college football team. They were in the championship. They were in the national championship. I don't know what division or whatever, but they walked into halftime, to the locker room at halftime, and they had absolutely dominated the other team. The game was a lock. They had won. This was a done deal, and they expected their coach to have this conversation with them that you guys did it, your hard work has paid off, you guys are awesome. Today is the day that you get to celebrate and appreciate all the work that you've put in. And what the coach told them was, don't let today be the best day of your life. You've worked hard, you've done something awesome, but don't let today be the day that you always go back to. Don't let the rest of your life be about this accomplishment. Because this is great and it's an achievement, but it's not the only achievement. There's a lot more to life than what's going on right here today. We all know people who've gotten stuck in a moment because we can get this idea that if we don't continue earning love, that if we don't continue producing and demonstrating how effective we are, that we don't deserve people to care about us and love us. That is not the truth. We can also be stuck on the other side by our mistakes. We can be stuck by the things that we have done wrong. It's so easy for us to just be crippled by our guilt. But one of the most amazing things about reading through God's Word is that we see heroes, people who are profoundly capable, that are all broken. Look at Abraham, we look at David, we look at Paul, and we see these guys, we see these people that messed up. They made big mistakes. And what God's answer to them is not, okay, you were doing pretty good, and then you made a mistake, so tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to let you just slide by. You're just barely going to make it in the door into God's kingdom. And when you get here, I want you to sit over in the corner and not say anything because you don't want anybody to know you're here because you barely made it. That is not his response. God says, you're a human being. I have a job for you. You're in my kingdom. Get to work. Abraham wasn't done because he made a mistake. Paul wasn't done because he did something he should have or shouldn't have. God said, I've got something for you to do. I've got a mission for you. I've got a task for you. You're in. You're all the way in. And I've got something, my will for you that I want to see happen. It's a pretty amazing story, and it gives me a lot of hope. Lastly, we can get absolutely stuck by sin. We can become enslaved by sin. Specifically what it says here. I know that most of us have probably had this experience where we make a decision that okay, I'm going to start eating healthy. I'm going to make all these really good choices. We go to the grocery store, fruit and vegetables, and man, that's all we're going to do. We're doing just super healthy diet, right? And we walk by and then we see that one thing. The thing that man, that bag of candy, whatever it is, that's my jam. And so we start this process of okay, I'm going to get it, but I'm only going to have 3 of them tonight, and then the next day I can have a couple. As long as I run a half marathon before work every morning, it'll all break even, So we get to the spot where we start compromising and playing this game. 3 days later, we walk into our kitchen, and we're who ate 2 boxes of Cheez-Its and 42 baby donuts? Because our behavior doesn't line up to the decision that we made. We decided we were going to do this, but we don't actually follow through. And I'm using a silly example, but the truth is we do this with pretty profound sin a lot of times. We end up in a spot where we say, never again. I'm never going to do this again. We step back and we say, this isn't worth it. The price that I pay, the thing that I get back, it doesn't add up. I'm not going to do this anymore. And so sometimes we make these decisions and we find ourselves right back in that cycle again. I really appreciated what Kevin said last week when he talked to us about this idea of being unashamed, because shame plays a part in this cycle. We see a lot of times people make a mistake. They do something they shouldn't do. And then they get to the spot where they feel absolutely terrible about it. And then one of the ways that people try to make sure they don't make the same mistake again is they beat themselves up really, really badly. I'm worthless, I'm terrible, I don't deserve anything, I'm the worst person in the world, and they just run this story that there's no value in them. Kind of with this idea that, man, if I beat myself bad enough, if I beat myself up bad enough about this, then I won't make the same mistake again. But what happens is we end up feeling so terrible about ourselves. We end up feeling that we don't have any value, and we end up feeling so bad that the thing we do in order to try to fix it is the same thing that got us there. We see it here, people call it a shame spiral, but it's this process of engaging and beating ourselves up so bad that we step right back into the same sin that we started with. See if I can find what my next section of notes are. Back page. As we talk about freedom, as we talk about slavery, we talk about our identity in our country and our nation of being a free people. There is a time in our nation's history that is embarrassing. It is heartbreaking. For a period, we thought it was okay. We gave people permission to own another person. And it's a time that we need to look back at with absolute heartbreak. And even as we see hints of racism pop up today, if you have any inkling of thinking that direction, then I encourage you to go back to scriptures like Galatians 8:23, where we see that our citizenship is in heaven, and that slave, free, Jew, Greek, that God feels the same about all of us. But we have a heartbreaking time in our history. And when we look at the stories that came out of that era, we see some extremely courageous, powerful stories. There was a man named Moses Hall. Moses Hall was a slave, but he was also a minister. He was taught by someone else and was extremely vocal and started to build a really strong church. There were both slaves and free men that were worshiping together. He would have these prayer meetings that tons of people would attend. And so at one point, some of the local slave owners were very intimidated by this. And so they went to him and basically raided and attacked this church. And they took his number one assistant, one of his best friends, and they killed him. And they threw Moses Hall on the ground, and they said, "Do you know what that's for?" And Moses said, for praying. And they said, we will have no more of your prayer meetings. And if we hear any more about it, you're next. Moses got up to his knees, folded his hands, and said, let us pray. The slave owners were so stunned, they didn't even know how to respond. They just faded off. The other slaves and members of the congregation gathered up around Moses. And right there, in the midst of this horrific moment, they had a prayer meeting. Moses knew that even as a slave, he knew what set him free. He knew where his freedom would come from. He knew the power of that freedom. When we look at this idea of freedom, there is an iconic moment in movies. The movie Braveheart is one that just resonates with me. We see the English forces and the Scottish forces. The Scots are trying to remove the English from their land. And at one point, they walk in, and there is the opposing force. They come up to the opposing force, and they see that they're overwhelmed. They see that they're outgunned. There's more of the English. They're more powerful. They have no hope. And so they're trying to decide what they're going to do. And one of the Scots says, we're going to run and live. And so William Wallace, the hero of the Scots, comes out. And he says, yes, run today and you may live. Fight and you may die. But many years from now, when you are laying in your beds, what would you give to come back to this day and tell your enemies that you may take our lives, but you will never take our freedom? And the Scottish army goes crazy, holds his claymore up, and they are ready to go to war. And so that is my question for us tonight. Are you ready to go to war? Are you ready to fight for your freedom? Are you ready to struggle for your freedom, to stand up for it and to claim it? Because at this point, it's not about what we do. It's about going out and claiming it. Because we don't have to die for our freedom. Somebody else already did. And when we look at the scripture in John, we see Jesus saying that I can make you a son, and you will have freedom. You will be free indeed. If you are in a spot where you want to claim that freedom, then we're going to do this response that we've been doing as we've gone through this series. So if you could bring that up for us on the slide. Actually, the next one. So let's talk through this. Please repeat after me. I am not what I have. I am not what I do. I am not what other people say about me. I am free. If you are free, then that's an amazing experience. If you were not, then we want to provide that opportunity for you. You can put Christ on in baptism and become free. If you're in a spot where maybe you've been free, but the battle's feeling pretty tough right now, things are feeling pretty difficult, and you need people to stand with you, you need people to walk with you, then we want to encourage you to do that as we stand and sing.